Welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining. Apologies from Professor Tom O'Loughlin. He sends his apologies, and I'll be chairing the meeting this morning. So we have two speakers. First is Dr. Alfred Osborne, and the second is Justin Michel Colvin, Reaux-Colvin. So. Just to begin, Dr. Alfred Osborne retired as a bishop of the Orthodox Church. He trained as a classicist with an interest in Semitic languages. He served as the first chairman of the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge and on the International Commission for Anglican Orthodox Theological Dialogue. He's a new book just coming out with Brett Bowles, The Origins of Christianity in the Calendar Wars of the 2nd Century BCE. That's in the Studia Traditionis Theologiae series. It's volume 60. And he previously published another work with Brett Bowles in 2019, A Cosmic Liturgy, Qumran's 364-day calendar. So Dr. Osborne, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I'm very glad to have this chance to be here, and regret very much that that Tom O'Loughlin is not here, because he actually arranged for this to take place. You've heard the title of the talk. But I'd like, before I start, just to say a few words more about my personal background. And that is that for 40 years before my retirement, I was celebrating the Byzantine liturgy in a parish that used two liturgical calendars, neither of which agreed with the civil calendar used by the society about us. And that revealed quite dramatically how attached one could become to a calendar that distinguished one's own community from that of others. It also showed me how quickly issues that are unrelated to the calendar can attach themselves to the calendar and have a lifespan even greater than interest in the calendar itself. These are the important ones, of course, in the context of that I will be speaking about, are the political, social, economic issues affecting the surrounding society. In my retirement, I've been working on the role of the 364-day calendar in the Second Temple period. And it has to be said right from the start that this calendar was never used outside the liturgy. And while it was in use, the calendar of civil society was always the Babylonian or Seleucid Macedonian lunisolar calendar. The 364-day calendar has been called a septenary calendar for a very good reason. The fundamental unit of time is actually the week, the 7-day week, which is then used to construct all larger units of time. There are exactly 52 weeks in a 364-day year, and as a result, all liturgical years are exactly the same, and the days of the month are strictly correlated with the days of the week. If you know the day of the month, you know the day of the week. Now, its significance for the history of the Second Temple derives from the fact that its followers believed that when the world was created, the year was exactly 52 weeks long, and that this remained the case until at some point before the flood, the angels governing the 7 planets rebelled against God's initial instructions and began to move as they do today. Thus, if you followed a calendar based on observation or worship, you were colluding with the fallen planetary angels, and your sacrifice was no longer valid. It ceased to reconcile you with God. in this forthcoming book, I will go further into that. But initially, I want to say that I was prompted to move into this area by the the fact that in this first book, I was able to show, I think, at least to my satisfaction, that the author of Jude, who cites the book of Enoch, a creation calendar text, as scripture, was aware of the cosmology behind the 364-day calendar and almost certainly used it himself. Now, encouraged by this, in the second book, I turned to the Gospels and Acts and was, I think, found it possible to show that on the basis of a philological argument published in 1920 by a man called Marcus Lidzbarski, a world-known Semiticist, he looked at the question of the use of Nazarinos and Nazareus in the Gospels and said, it's not easy to find out what these words mean, so let's look at the Talmud. He himself was Jewish and had a Talmudic training in his background. In the Talmud, Jesus is referred to as Yeshu HaNotzri. And he showed, I think, satisfactorily that the Greek renderings, that these terms, Nazarinos and Nazareus, are Greek renderings of Aramaic adjectives which tell us that Jesus' contemporaries thought of him as a Notzri, and that this meant, in the context of the time, that he was a strict guardian of the law. These epithets do not tell us that Jesus came from Nazareth. And against the background of Jude's use of the creation calendar, I suggested that Jesus also was a follower of the old calendar tradition, whose adherents considered their interpretation of the Torah to be the only correct interpretation. Now, this approach, if true, gives us for the first time a chance to place Jesus accurately in the political, social, and theological world of the first century AD. And on this basis, I analyzed all passages in the Gospels and Acts where these two terms occur, and concluded that in every case, this understanding of their meaning brings alive and deepens our understanding of their significance in the social and political conditions of the time. What quickly became clear was that in 33 AD, the Notzrim, the followers of the creation calendar tradition, were considered by both Roman and Jewish authorities to be a serious threat to public order. On this basis, I looked at three further areas. I began by asking myself how a movement that had effectively been suppressed since the introduction of the lunisolar calendar in the temple in the middle of the 2nd century ended up being a threat to Rome in 33 AD. By inserting the calendar, which is never mentioned in any of our surviving Jewish or Christian, main Christian texts, main tradition Christian texts, by inserting it into the existing historical narrative about the troubles in the middle of the 2nd century, the wars over Hellenization, I came to and following this through consistently by saying, the thing about a calendar is you either follow it or you don't. And that meant that you could always ask of any individual in a historical narrative, which calendar does he follow? And just applying that step by step gives you a consistent picture of what actually was happening in spite of what our texts say. and it showed that the struggle against Hellenization in the 2nd century BC was in fact a civil war between supporters of the old 364-day calendar and the supporters of the new lunisolar calendar introduced by the high priest Menelaus in 172. Menelaus' action led to 10 years of civil war, the Calendar Wars, which lasted until 163 BC, when Menelaus was actually executed by the Seleucid king Antiochus V and replaced by Alcimus, who promptly reintroduced the creation calendar. This mood led to 10 years of peace. When Jonathan Maccabee was appointed high priest in about 151, however, he reintroduced the lunisolar calendar and used his powers as the province's civil, military, and religious leader to suppress all opposition to the change. Violence was used if necessary. At this point, adherents of the creation calendar tradition either left the country or went underground. It continued to be used, of course, as we can see from the finds at Qumran, where it seems to have been used for 200 years, 20 miles from Jerusalem, until the destruction of that site by the Romans in something like 68 AD. And of course, it was also used by those others whose literary works are all that has survived. Nevertheless, as I said, this calendar is never mentioned in any text preserved in Rabbinic Judaism or by the Great Church. We would still be in the dark about all of this if the Book of Enoch and Jubilees had not been preserved in Ge'ez by the Christians of Ethiopia. On the basis of this story, I concluded that the struggle over the calendar had seriously divided the nation, and that support for the creation calendar had never really disappeared. In the third section of the book, I then looked at the war against Rome that culminated in the Great Rebellion of 66 to 70 AD. Once again, by inserting the unmentionable creation calendar into the history of the struggle, I was able to show that resistance to Roman rule was instigated and led by adherents of that suppressed creation calendar tradition. The tensions in Judea were manageable by the Hasmonean kings until the Roman conquest brought an end to Judean independence in 63 BC. This led at once to the rise of rural banditry as a form of social protest, led most successfully by a certain Ezekias, who was the father of Judas the Galilean. Herod the Great's first step on his rise to power was the capture and execution of Ezekias, bringing to end his career, not Herod's, as a brigand chief that had lasted for more than 20 years. Supporters of the old calendar took a lead in this rebellion right from the start. Josephus says that Ezekias' son, Judas the Galilean, invented his fourth philosophy and started the revolt in 6 AD. At the end of his history, he says that the fourth philosophy had motivated the Sicarii, who played such an important role in the rebellion. And he also tells us that the Sicarii had come down from Masada, which they'd captured early in the war, and attacked En-Gedi on the Feast of Passover. As Annie Joubert saw in 1972, This means that they followed a different calendar. At the time, no pious Jew would have chosen to attack on their own Passover. This is enough to show us that the Sicarii are also Notzrim. We get a timeline then for the participation of the Notzrim in the rebellion. In 63 BC, Pompey takes control of Judea, and Ezekias begins his career as a brigand chief. In 4 BC, Herod the Great dies. Political confusion, and Judas the Galilean captures the Roman military headquarters at Sepphoris, the capital of Galilee, and carries off their arms for his own men. In 6 AD, at the dismissal of Archelaus as king by the Romans and the start of direct Roman rule, Judas the Galilean incites the Judeans to refuse to pay taxes and begins a campaign again of rural banditry. In 33, Jesus is crucified as Yeshu ha-Notzri. In 66 AD, the 10th Roman Legion is wiped out as it withdraws from Jerusalem, where they'd gone to suppress disturbances in the capital. That marked the outbreak of the Great Rebellion. And instrumental in that Great Rebellion, and one of the leaders at the very beginning, was a certain Menachem, himself a descendant of Judas the Galilean. And of course, in 70 AD, we saw the destruction, Roman capture of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the temple. What's interesting is that the Roman authorities agreed with Josephus that the instigators of this great rebellion were the Notzrim, the Sicarii and their leaders, and they showed this by executing Simon Bar Giora in their triumph in Rome and condemning the second in command, the second most important leader, simply to life imprisonment. In the fourth section, I move beyond the destruction of the temple and consider what happens afterwards. In around 90 AD, the successors of the Pharisees, early rabbinic scholars who are now centered in Yavne, decide to introduce a reference to the Notzrim in the 12th petition of the standing prayer that is recited daily in the synagogues that they lead. In it, the Notzrim are now cursed and denied a place in heaven. This prayer was still being used in the 10th century AD, as we know from texts that were found in the Cairo Geniza. When first included, it was not, as some have thought, directed against the early Christians, but against the Notzrim as being responsible for the destruction of the temple. The Christians were insignificant at the time. They had withdrawn and played no part in the revolt. Now, it seems obvious, in retrospect now, that the communities of Jewish Christians who were known as Nazarenes or Nazareans by the church fathers also grew out of and continued the creation calendar tradition. In the Eastern Roman regions of the Roman Empire, they survived until at least the 5th century, and we know that from Jerome. Now, if we look at the results of this sort of approach to our understanding of the earliest Christian communities, we need to accept that Jesus was known to be and was described repeatedly in the Gospels and Acts as a Notzri, an adherent of the creation calendar tradition. His first followers were known as the sect of the Nazareans, Acts 24:5. Many of his first followers were probably also Nazrim, and thus by training and inclination, strict observers of the law, which they believed required use of the old calendar. And as Nazrim, they were subject to persecution by religious and civil authorities from the start. We should expect to find, therefore, traces of the creation calendar liturgical tradition and beliefs in the earliest Christian texts. And one example that is fairly straightforward concerns the calendar itself. In the Christian calendar, the crucifixion, Pentecost, and the crucifixion fall on Sunday every year. No feast is linked to a date of the week on the lunisolar calendar or on a solar calendar, which, like the Julian Gregorian calendars. And the reason is, for these two other calendars, the day of the week changes from year to year. But the most important result for the understanding of the origins of Christian prayer and the Eucharist is the fact that when the first post-resurrection communities gradually took place after Pentecost in 33, most of its founding members had behind them a 200-year-old tradition of worship as faithful Jews that made no use of ritual sacrifice. The existing Jerusalem temple played no role. It was impure, and its sacrifices were of no effect. It was the same at Qumran. As Newsom says, since the Qumran community could not conduct an actual sacrificial cult, atonement was effected through the community's prayer, through its praise and obedience to the law. And this was presumably, I mean, this is conjectural completely, the experience of Jesus as he grew up. In the various scattered communities of Nazrim that formed after the introduction of the lunisolar calendar in 151 or so, the local gathering, when it met, replaced the temple on earth, while the heavenly temple remained unchanged. It was what it had always been, God's residence in the heavens. And this was the case even after the connection between the heavenly and the earthly temple had been broken. And it explains why such texts as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, in which no sacrifice is actually made, exist. Now, in this third part of the talk, I'd like to look at the Didache and the place of its liturgy in the tradition, but by addressing only one issue, and that is the question raised by the Didache 11:11 and its notorious crux, Pion is mysterion cosmikon ecclesias. Forgive me for using modern Greek pronunciation. I can't go back to the old one. The context of Didache 11:11 is what to do about wandering teachers and prophets, and specifically what to do if a prophet whom the community has accepted as genuine should veer off-piste and call for behavior that the community has learned is wrong. The text reads, any prophet who has been tested, is genuine, is working, and I translate literally, for the mystery of the church, but does not teach others to do what he does himself, shall not be judged by you, for his judgment is with God. For the prophets of old did the same. And I take pion here without an object to mean simply to act, to do, in this case to work, to be efficacious in the case of medicines. and that is points simply shows that the action is aimed in a particular direction, has a particular purpose. And the obvious, straightforward expression in Greek is agathon, for good. Well, this is for the cosmic mystery of the church, whatever that means. Now, my suggestion is that in this passage, the expression mysterion cosmikon is in fact a translation of the Hebrew expression ras nihye, well attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that ecclesia here simply represents the Hebrew kahal, since it is consistently used to translate this word in the Septuagint. And that the whole phrase mysterion cosmikon ekklesias is a slavish translation of the Hebrew construct chain ras nihye kahal, something unattested elsewhere, in which ras nihye are in the construct state and kahal in the absolute. If this is the case, it seems to me that the expression ras nihye kahal, which is preserved here in a compressed Greek form, mimicking the Hebrew, and without any of the definite articles that could have been used, that this phrase has major significance in the early Hebrew Aramaic language stage of the church's development, and is here a kind of fossil carryover that was soon felt to be unnecessary. Now, unfortunately, the Hebrew expression ras nihye kahal, like its Greek translation, says little more on its own than that the ras nihye pertains to the church. And thus, if mysterion cosmikon is indeed a linguistic calque of ras nihye, we are obliged to begin our identification with what it meant in its earlier context within the creation calendar tradition. Ras is a straightforward Persian loanword used in the Hebrew Bible only in Daniel 2 and 4, and then it's used in its Aramaic form. Ras is frequent, however, elsewhere in Second Temperate literature, as in the Aramaic fragments of First Enoch. And everywhere its meaning is clear. It always refers to a secret revealed by heaven, from heaven. Nihye, however, is difficult to translate accurately in English, or indeed into Greek or any other West European language. And this can be seen from the variety of English translations that have been proposed. It is the nifal participle of the verb haya, to be or to become, and one might think it could therefore easily be translated with this participial form of, say, ina or ginithe or eparchi. But this is rendered problematic by the way English, like Greek, regularly gives its verbal forms a temporal character, past, present, or future. Hebrew is much more vague. To judge from its use at Qumran, Nihye refers to the entire scope of history, the past, present, and future. And thus, what has come into being and what is includes the creation of the world, its present state, its development over time, and its eschaton as aspects of a single whole. For example, in 4Q instruction, we are told all that has come to be is in it, in the ras nihye. Why it exists is in it, and what will be is in it. And the treatise of the two spirits in the Rule of Qumran says the same, but stresses the prior knowledge of God. From the God of knowledge stems all there is and all there shall be. Kol hoye we nihye, all using the participial form of haya and its default participle. My suggestion is that whoever translated the Hebrew expression into Greek saw the problem and found a solution. He avoids any attempt at a literal translation, trying to convey the meaning in another way by using cosmikos. This is an adjective derived here from cosmos in the sense of universe, and thus, by definition, includes the whole. Cosmic mystery, which is sometimes used for mysterion cosmikon, is in fact a much better translation of ras nihye than any of those that attempt to incorporate the verbal notion of being or coming into being. Now, on the basis of what we see in the Qumran material, this expression is used primarily in only two texts. One is the Book of Instruction, and the other is the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. From these, we can see that the ras nihye is known only to God. And thus, if we are to know it, it has to be revealed to individuals, and this happens in an ongoing process. In the rule of Qumran, towards the end, it says, "For from the source of his knowledge, he has disclosed his light, and my eyes have observed his wonders, and the light of my heart, the ras nihye." So the cosmic mystery is something that individuals can be given a glimpse of. Once known, it's something that must be studied and reflected upon. In 4Q instruction, the mevin, the one who understands, is told to gaze upon, to examine, to meditate upon, and even to grasp the ras nihye. The angels themselves study the ras nihye, but they are not involved in its revelation to mankind. Significantly, no angel appears in any Qumran text to explain the ras nihye. In essence, it seems that they know more about it than is theoretically available to mankind. That is, the mystery as has already been revealed by God and by creation. In the 4Q instruction, the teachers, the maskilim, take the place of the angels. And the mevin, who understands, is told, "Increase in understanding greatly, and from all your teachers get even more understanding." And equally important, this ras nihye also contains knowledge and understanding of how human beings should behave in this world. And it reveals the consequences of their actions at the end of the present age. And thus, as Harrington says, knowledge of this mystery serves to guide and direct the behavior of the righteous in the present. And this provides a context for the requirement that the prophet in the Didache is expected to teach and behave in accordance with revealed truth about God's requirements for human behavior. But what about the meaning of the expression ras nihye kahal, mysterion cosmikon ecclesias? Although ras nihye is found frequently in limited texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and although kahal appears frequently on its own in the scrolls referring to the Qumran community, these three words never appear together as a single expression. So clearly with the church, the founding of the church, something new has appeared in the creation calendar tradition. The focus of the Ras Nihye is now not on personal destiny in the last days, but on the fate of the community brought together by their relationship to one man, Yeshu HaNozri. One's personal salvation, therefore, is dependent upon its being shared with others. And as a result, the requirements for membership and full community in the prayer of the church, full communion, immediately move to center stage. And this is what we find in the Didache at the very outset of the church's story. The life of Jesus, the Lord, is taken as the behavioral norm, and the community's life and an individual future glory is built around his person and how he behaved in relation to others while in the world. What then is the visiting prophet expected to do here? Bearing in mind the use of is in Didache 11:2, where the teacher, the daskalos, is required to increase righteousness and knowledge of the Lord, I would propose as an adequate translation of Didache 11:11, any prophet who has been tested, is genuine, and is working to further understanding of the cosmic mystery of the church, but does not teach others to do what he does himself, shall not be judged by you. So it's
So, Alfred, are you trying to share a screen?
We're here. We're here. Yeah. It just suddenly flicked out.
Oh, we can hear. We can hear you fine.
You can hear. Okay.
Yes.
I don't know what happened there, but there we are. Okay, nearly there.
Nearly there. What is he expected to do? He is expected to further understanding of the cosmic mystery of the church as a community in the end of time. And when does the prophet make his contribution? In Didache 10:1, the description of the Eucharist is closed with the words, "After you have had your fill, give thanks in this way." And a form of prayer is then given for the host of the meal to say, which closes in Didache 10:5-6, with the request that God will gather the church together from the four winds into the kingdom that he has prepared for it, and ends with, "Let grace come and let this world pass away," ending with the Aramaic exclamation, Maranatha, Amen. The strength of the eschatological expectation here is obvious. So based on this statement and the ending of the prayers of the service with prayers of thanksgiving, and in Didache 10:7, the requirement that the host allow the prophet to give thanks for as long as he wishes, it seems likely that the itinerant prophet's contribution took place at the end of the service, that it prolonged the thanksgiving in a very distinctive way and could be seen as its culmination. And this would give him the opportunity to share with the community whatever insights he may have received into the Ras Nihye Kahal, the cosmic mystery of the church, and in this way expand and progress the community's understanding of their relationship to God in Jesus. I suspect that in the early days of the church, liturgical prophecy played its own role in driving forward theological development and change. But the overall conclusions that I would draw from this second book is that the identification of Jesus and the earliest community as Notzrim provides a realistic social and cultural context for the gospel narrative that is otherwise hard to find. That it offers a better framework within which to assess the radical newness of Jesus' message, that it gives us access from a Christian point of view to the richness of the creation calendar tradition, that it provides a proper theological context within which to read the Gospels and the earliest Christian texts, and that it opens a new way to approach the early development of the Christian liturgy. But also, this may be, and I think is equally important, it offers a new and more realistic way to understand the relationship between Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. They are both the working out in constantly changing historical conditions of two distinct and often competing religious traditions within the Jewish nation, both of whose roots go back to the beginning of the Second Temple period and probably beyond. So anyway, that's the talk.
Thank you so much, Alfred. Thank you for that talk. Apologies for the Zoom shenanigans.
Well, it's our fault. I think I let my hand run over the keyboard and hit something
No,
and just turned it off.
I'm still trying to figure out a few things with Zoom, but thank you so much for that talk. And just to say to everyone that I'll send out a link to the book, which I believe is being published this month. So we have some minutes for questions, for discussion. Just want to open it to the floor. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or unmute. Thank you.
I have one question.
Thanks, Piero.
Thank you, Professor Alexander. And thank you, Professor Dr. Alfred Osborne, for your very interesting speech and paper about of course, the 334-day calendar tradition as background of the first Christian Eucharistic liturgy. My question, Professor, I know that the general background in a historical way is the antique, of course, is antique period, as you said. However, I think in a general meaning, and bearing in mind this cosmology, you talk about the 7 planets, also the flood in the beginning, intervention of angels, the book of Enoch, and a creation view, and later, of course, connecting this with with Jesus, that was a full lover of the old calendar. However, my question is about, and bearing in mind this 664 days calendar, the septenary, do you know any information if Bede the Venerable, early 8th century, had what had to say Bede about this theory? I talk about Bede because, as a renowned calculist, and also I think it would be interesting to know what Bede has to say in the later centuries, of course, many later centuries in the early Middle Ages, but especially in a time where all the knowledge from antique and also taken from Isidore of Seville, also from the continent, and that arrived to the insular culture as a transmission of knowledge to Ireland and then to North England, especially in Northumbria and Bernicia. If Bede used this 364 days calendar and what has to say about it, because using this base, in the later early medieval tradition of the old tradition, the old antique view of knowledge taken from antiquity. Of course, that's my question, Professor, please.
So to summarize, it's whether Bede the Venerable knew about this calendar. Is that correct, Piero?
Yes. Is how my apologies, because English is not my first language, as you can see. I'm in Spain right now, a PhD student in a Complutense University. And my background is also related with the connection with the continent and the insular tradition, connecting San Isidore and Bede, but also taking in account all the antique tradition. But yeah, my question, as the Professor Alexander said, is what Bede has to say about this theory as a calculist. Yes.
Sorry.
What does Bede have to say about this calendar?
The problem, I'm really not familiar with the later material. I personally am quite limited in my knowledge of the sort of, say, after the 4th, 5th centuries.
Okay.
But I wouldn't be surprised if something didn't survive in the sort of either most likely among the Celtic monks, but you will know much more about this than I do. I'm not really familiar with this material.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Piero. Thank you. Any other questions or discussion? Justin, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Osborne, for the invigorating talk. My question actually heads the opposite direction from Piero's. We know from Livy that Numa, the legendary second king of Rome, sort of established Roman politics around sort of calendar reform. We can also see this in Julius Caesar during his dictatorship, reform the calendar, this idea of calendar reform. I'm wondering, does this 364-day calendar, does this abut power politics in Judea in any way? What can we say about this calendar telling people what time it is, if you get my drift?
I think one has to accept that anyone who uses a calendar of this nature is quite happy to have a disconnect between their liturgical calendar and the civil calendar that's used elsewhere. So they don't there are lots of questions that they don't ask of the liturgical calendar. Like, what day of the week, what day of the month is it? Because it'll probably be a different day of the month out there than it is inside the church. And one just has to accept that. And it's surprising how easy it is to live like that. I mean, I'm sorry. You find today, for example, that there are Orthodox Christians who date their letters with 2 dates, one according to the Julian and another according to the Gregorian calendar. Not a problem, but that goes back that we have the papyri from Elephantine, 5th century BC. You have 2 dates on them, one the Egyptian date and the other the Babylonian date. So, we can live with it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Any other questions? I have a question, Alfred. In terms of Nazareth, am I right in thinking that it's do we know how the village of Nazareth was called in Hebrew? And is there the case, say, in terms of the Jesus the Nazarene, that it can mean both in terms of the?
It is a very interesting question. There was actually no archaeological evidence for the ancient village of Nazareth, which exists today, before the last century. And then somebody found a piece of stone which had Nazareth written on it, which is the Hebrew from Nazareth, which we knew from Hebrew texts, medieval Hebrew texts. So there's no problem with that. But the problem with Nazareth is that it does, with a bit of effort, enable you to derive Nazarinos in Greek from Nazareth via Hebrew and Aramaic. It does not allow you to derive Nazareos. That doesn't work. So the problem is to explain Nazareos, and this is what Lidzbarski did so brilliantly.
Mm, mm. And so your hypothesis that would link in to presumably Qumran as well and John the Baptist and in terms of, is that a link that you're making as well with the early?
As I say, in every situation, you have to ask yourself, what calendar does this man use? Ask yourself that question about John the Baptist.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's only one answer. He used the creation calendar.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Any final questions? Damien, yes.
Hello, thank you for the wonderful talk. I really enjoyed that. It's at times like this we need somebody like Davio Cronin who knows about the calendrical tradition in the insular world. In those debates in 7th and 8th century in Ireland, the issue of separation, calendar, which calendar you follow and which tradition you follow determines whether you're Orthodox or not. Small o. In that debate, questions about the Council of Jerusalem seem to rattle through in some of the sources. And that debate is really about separating Christian identity from its Jewish precursor. Does the debate about calendrical tradition figure, how prominently does that figure in the earliest of those debates, in the Jerusalem Council, for example, 50 CE? Does it crop up at all?
At what time?
In the say about in the first century.
Fourth century. First century. My hearing is not the best. In the first century, it must have been going on, but we don't have a record of it. And we just have to assume that they were talking about these issues, but that, as I said earlier, very often issues that are not related to the calendar become primary, and they decide which way you jump rather than the calendar itself.
Thanks. Because in the insular world, the debate was never anything. It was never about mere mathematics. It was about much more important things.
Exactly.
Thank you, Damien. Any final questions?
I have one small one, not too long.
Yes, Piero. Yeah.
Yeah, going more to the area, to the century that the professor Alfred Osborne talked. Professor, I have one question. Did Josephus, Josephus the historian, use this calendar? And what did he say in general about it as a tradition in the east area in Jerusalem and very near to some centuries after the death of Jesus Christ? What is Josephus' view about this calendar in the late first century?
Well, I asked myself one question. Does Jesus ever mention the calendar? And is there anything in what he says that suggests that he considered it an important issue?
Cephas.
And does Josephus?
Josephus, sorry. Okay. Does Josephus use it? No,
Yes,
he never
sorry,
mentions it.
Is my speaking, sorry.
No.
Josephus, yes.
He doesn't
Okay,
mention
let's
it.
go back to Josephus. This is very interesting because I referred to the fourth philosophy. And
Yeah.
people have always wondered what the fourth philosophy is because he introduces it rather early in his account of the war and then says, I'll tell you about it later. And he proceeds to tell us about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And you finish the work, and he's never told you about the fourth philosophy. He doesn't do it. And it's the fourth philosophy, which is the creation calendar tradition. It was literally unmentionable. It was a source. Well, I mean, read the book because it was a source of, well, a great deal hung on the issue. The legitimacy of the Hasmonean kings, all kinds of things, I say. So it was better not to talk about it. And the Christians, the early Christians, and I'd go into this in detail, saw very quickly that to be associated with the Notzrim, who had just been accused of fomenting the Great Rebellion, was not a good look in the classical world. And it's all there in the texts. You can watch the term Nazarene and Nazarene gradually be edited out of the New Testament texts in the manuscripts and in the Gospels. And Paul, although he starts out proudly speaking about Jesus, the Notzri, to both the Romans and the Jews, by the time he gets to his letters, he doesn't do it anymore because he's working with a very different audience now, and they don't want to hear the term, and he doesn't want to use it. So it's just wiped out, quite understandably.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Underground.
Thank you again, Alfred, for a very stimulating and certainly thought-provoking paper. Thank you. We'll now move to our second speaker, Justin Reaux-Colvin. Just now, Justin will be speaking on Ex Salive Scripturae Meae, Patrick the Roman and his Latinity. Justin teaches Latin, Greek, and ancient and late antique culture classes at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and the Latin Greek Institute at the City University of New York. His work has been published in Viator, and he has forthcoming articles in Traditio, the Classical Journal, the Journal of Late Antiquity, and Speculum. He thinks about ethnicity in late antiquity, especially in terms of historiography and religious identity. He's also my co-author for a new book that we've completed called Savages and Saints, the Ireland, the Irish and Irishness from antiquity to the coming of the English, under contract with Princeton University Press. And this is concerning the ethnic perception of the Irish by non-Irish people from Julius Caesar to the Angevins around the turn of the 13th century. So Justin, thanks for your paper, and over to you.
Certainly. Can you please enable screen sharing, Alex?
Sure.
Thanks for that fulsome introduction. Working with you these past years has been the privilege of a lifetime. One thing Alex didn't mention is the fact that he is my children's godfather and confirmation sponsor. So he must have felt some compulsion to extend this invitation to me. I hope this bald nepotism doesn't serve to dilute this talk. The subject of this lecture is the Latin of the historical Patrick, not the Patrick of pious memory, not the Patrick of national or loyalist allegiance, but the language of the man himself, as near as we can meet him from the two extraordinary texts he has left behind. These two texts, his Confessio and his Epistola ad Milites Corotici, written in a Latin that D.A. Benci called stumbling and barbarous, are the only items that survive from his pen. True, some very interesting and compelling pieces purporting to originate with Patrick, a handful of dicta, a collection of canones, a paragraph of Jocelyn of Furness's late 12th century Vita Patriciae, fall out of the ambit of this talk. I think it's prudent to clarify the following. Nothing outside Patrick's own authentic composition provides us any cogent details about Patrick's life and career. The many lives commemorating the saint, that of Tirchon and Mercou, and a handful of others besides, are practically useless to the study of Patrick as an historical person. These later texts are exercises in hero making. Napoleon looked nothing like Joaquin Phoenix. The annalistic tradition, having begun earnestly in the 7th or 8th centuries, likewise gives us nothing incontestable. Our only strategy of approach, then, is to cleave closely to these two remarkable texts and attempt, as near as we're able, to see what Patrick has to tell us in his own voice. In some ways, this talk is an opening salvo, a first installment of a rather Teutonic tome I'm presently writing under contract for Thomas O'Loughlin's Studia Traditionis Theologiae series of Brepols. That project, when it is completed, will offer a corrected biographical account of Patrick's life, sounding some of the same agnostic maybes and perhapses you will hear here, a fresh examination of St. Patrick's Latin, with which this talk promises in its incipient stages, a more generous scale and scope for Patrick's reading, a point rather too large for this talk to sufficiently accommodate, and a more sympathetic vision of Patrick's rhetorical prowess, a topic with which this talk will conclude, and a sharper picture of Patrick's late 4th and early 5th century environmental and material circumstances, a topic that, as well, cannot be nearly accommodated by this talk. I'm presently writing the book and hope to have it delivered to press before the patrician year of 2031, which, if my argument will obtain, is rather useless for establishing a chronology of his career. I've elected to divide this paper into 6 interlocking parts. I will briefly and tentatively sketch out Patrick's life and his authorial moment from his own compositions. When Patrick looked in the mirror, he saw a Roman. Given the details about his social status and abduction, which I see no reason to doubt, we can make tentative guesses about his education, a topic which will form the second part of this talk. Third, given an estimate of his era and given our understanding of Roman education, we can make some deductions about his Latin. Scholars have been needlessly unkind to Patrick on this front. And fourth, we can and must read Patrick's Latinity as an exponent of his own compositional moment. No author writes in a vacuum, and Patrick was no different. Finally, in parts 5 and 6, we can interrogate what sort of rhetorical persona Patrick invents for himself, and how that particular persona might fit into patristics as a genre and patrology as a discipline. Patrick is a forgotten father, living a generation after Hilary of Poitiers and Basil of Caesarea, contemporary with Jerome, Augustine, John Cassian, and Germanus, and serving as a notional exemplum for missionaries like Columba, Augustine of Canterbury, Paulinus of York, and Boniface. First, the obligatory introduction to Patrick of his own claims. Patrick was born into the petty nobility of Roman Britain. His family was notionally Christian, but Patrick did not seem too diligent in the faith. He committed an unknown sin at 14, a sin that only took an hour to commit. At 15, he was shanghaied into slavery and sold in Ireland. In Ireland, he rediscovered his faith. He pastured sheep in the forest of Vaucluse, likely in County Mayo, on the west coast. And he escapes from slavery and travels miraculously to an awaiting boat where some saucy sailors give him a ride. His journey lasts 3 days. He makes landfall in the desert, spends about 60 days wandering with the sailors, and after an interval of a few years, makes it back home to Britain. In a vision, he is called to spread the word of God in the land of his former captivity. At some time, we don't know when, he was charged with a crime. Which crime? We don't know. Perhaps this crime had something to do with financial impropriety. At some time, at least 25 years into his ministry, he promulgated an open letter anathematizing an uncertain Coroticus and his armed men for kidnapping catechumens. It is very likely that Patrick's epistula preceded his confessio, and if E.P. Thompson is correct, Patrick wrote the latter in the aftermath of the former. Whatever the case, Patrick wrote as an old man. We know neither the date of Patrick's birth nor the date of his death. Now, after over 100 years of patrician studies, we're no closer to resolving the question of his lifespan. If you've read hundreds of monographs and articles on Patrick's career, as I have, dates will buzz in your head as a hive of May bees. Patrick gives us no dates. Scholars have imagined datable criteria into being, and usually this task involves taking some date as a mooring, whether suggested by Patrick or deduced logically from outside sources that would render Patrick's information sensible. An example of this line of reasoning would be Patrick's reference to pagan Franks. Franks were long known to Romans, being first referenced by Tacitus and then featuring as marauding barbarians of the 4th and 5th centuries, appearing as antagonists in the Panegyrici Latini, Ammianus Marcellinus, the Historia Augusta, less so in Claudian, Zosimus, etc. Patrick references them, a custom of the Roman Christians of the Gaulish people. They send appropriately holy men to the Franci and other gentes, by which Patrick means pagan people, with so many thousands of solidi for the purpose of buying back baptized captives. Since Clovis was baptized in 508, as were the thinking goes his Franks, Patrick must have been writing before this event. But is the date as ironclad as all that? All Patrick has told us is that A, he's aware of a people group called the Franci, B, he thinks they're rapacious pagans, and C, they form a rhetorically useful datum for his argument about ransoming captives. He cites no specifics, he offers no names, he gives us no chain of custody for his information. What we have is an author grasping at rhetorical straws. The further one looks into Patriciana, the more dates one must unmoor from certainty. Among these, we might include Palladius's date of dispatch by Pope Celestine, 431, the career of Coroticus, Patrick's Objet d'invective, reckoned mid-5th century, and others. Really, Patrick gives us few certainties. We're on sure footing when we can point to the verbiage that Patrick shares with other authors. In this case, Patrick's specific turns of phrase and use of language is datable according to our knowledge of the publication dates of other works. Most of these works are Hieronymian. 3 will suffice as a means of demonstration. First, as noted by John Oulton in 1940, Confessio 4 is extremely closely related verbally to Jerome's recension of a creedal symbolum advanced by Victorinus of Patau in a commentary on Revelations in the late 3rd century. Oulton convincingly dates this recension to 406, giving us our first terminus post quem for Patrick's writings. Though scholars such as Ludwig Bieler and R.P.C. Hansen sought to modify this episode of reliance, the parallels are difficult to wave away. Second, as noted by Andy Kane in 2010, Confessio 10 bears a 4-word verbal string lifted from Jerome's Epistula 52. Appropriately, this letter became a standard manual for pastoral care, for a church awaiting its great Gregory. Because this letter is datable to 393, we have our second terminus post quem for Patrick's writings. Third, as noted by Ludwig Bieler in 1947, the Bible Patrick used was a patchwork affair, drawing sometimes from a Vetus Latinus witness, sometimes from a Sacra Vulgata. These Patrick quotes regularly. He seems to possess a Gallic Psalter, a Vulgate Acts, a pre-Hieronymian Old Testament and Revelation, and a transitional New Testament with some pre-Hieronymian readings, supplemented by the Vulgate. Since Jerome worked on the Vulgate between 383 and 405, the presence of any Vulgate readings must postdate that period. So in the sketchiest details, we have an author who must have worked in a period after Jerome, probably not long after, but long enough for Vulgate translations to have made it from Bethlehem to Patrick's page a continent away. I can advance no date with confidence, but I rather suspect that Patrick's symbolum, his possession of a pastoral manual, and his peculiar Bible all came to him during his sacerdotal training, whenever and wherever he might have undertaken. But we can gain greater certainties when we look at Patrick's description of his own status, his sense for money and value, and his view of geography and the built environment, his sense for the human life cycle, and his conceptualization of Romanitas. In every instance, these build to a picture of a self-conscious Roman. And given Patrick's origins in Roman Britannia on the eve of its system's collapse, these coalesce into rather apocalyptic dating criteria. First, Patrick introduces us to his family. I had a father, Calpurnius, a diaconus, and a certain son, a potatus, a presbyter. As Roy Fleckner notes, Patrick's reference to his father's diaconal status is a veiled claim of his own status. Patrick says, I was born to a father of the decurionate. Patrick's father, then, was, like Augustine's father, a member of his town's presiding council, responsible for collecting and sending along the annona, the payment for the perquisites of participating in the Roman world. Fleckner, following Thomas Charles Edwards, has elected to interpret this aspect of Patrick's self-description as evidence of some avoidance. Patrick, in this view, was rather a tax dodger than a missionary. Such an intervention is fascinating, but out of step with the genuine piety that Patrick displays throughout the rest of his two texts. To be sure, Patrick is talking about his own nobility, but he is also talking about the world that produced him. Patrick seems eager to make the case that he was a product of a Roman environment. Second, Patrick reckons his family wealth, giving us a sense for how he imagined value. They, those who snatched me, devastated the male enslaved persons and female enslaved persons of the house of my father. Patrick's family were slave owners, as would be expected of a late Roman noble family. Really, we might look at Patrick's account of his own enslavement as a gross status inversion. A highborn son, humbled and brought low, in accordance with certain revolutionary strains of Christ's ministry. More on that to come. When Patrick thinks of money, he uses terms familiar to Roman currency. Remember the Franks and their so many thousands of solidi? The solidus, first struck by Diocletian and standardized by Constantine, replaced the aureus over the course of the 4th century, eventually serving as the standard unit of monetary value in place of the increasingly debased denarius. Again, Patrick tells us in a counterfactual. Perhaps, however, when I baptized so many thousands of people, did I hope from some of them for even half a scruple? A scrupulum, realized by Patrick as scripula, altering the internal vowel in accordance with late Latin spelling and uniquely deploying it as a feminine noun, was 1/24 of a Roman untia. He is performing his familiarity with Roman weights. Patrick then was comfortable with Roman units of value. There is, though, a secondary economy that Patrick references, and this economy was predicated on flesh. When discussing his expenditure on Crimea among the reguli of Ireland, he reckons the amount he distributed. For I suppose I distributed to them not less than the price of 15 persons. We should be aware that Patrick is talking about the cost of enslaved persons. Diocletian's edict on prices fixed the cost of an urban slave to 30,000 denarii, decreasing from that base price dependent on sex and age. Patrick's intent here is to assign an exorbitant value to his distribution of Crimea. Crunching the numbers would yield a monetary total of 50 talents. We should also be aware that the cumul, a female slave, was a foundational monetary unit of pre-economic Ireland, voiced in Brian law. According to Neil McClung, a single cumul was worth 3 ounces of silver or 3 milk cows. Whether Patrick's monetary sense for flesh here speaks to a Roman or Irish tradition, and given the audience of his letters, I rather think the former is more likely, is somewhat irrelevant. He is, however, treating as neutral the cornerstone of the Roman economy, which was slavery. There was no emancipation movement in antiquity. Third, Patrick exposes us to the environs of his youth. Calpurnius was living in the township of Benevento Bernii, for he had a villula nearby where I suffered capture. Leaving aside the toponymic designation, which Beeler realized as Banavim Tibernii, as presently irrecoverable, Patrick describes his native community as a vicus, a word Cicero uses to refer to a district, a neighborhood, a collection of houses. Basically, it's a hamlet as distinct from an urbs, an oppidum, or a colonia. We can imagine this environment as a small rural community, probably not significant enough to merit its own decurionate, perhaps a satellite community of a larger civic center. The equation is underscored by Patrick's assessment of his family home as a villula. The sense that Patrick preserves conjures to mind a cottage dedicated to rustication. While late Latin tends to ignore the smallness of the literal diminutive, we might here take it seriously. Depending on whether Calpurnius indeed served in a civic capacity, Patrick's family may well have owned a domus urbana and a villula, where Patrick found himself subject to capture. The formulation Patrick uses to describe the process of capture, dedi capturam, which he uses twice, was thought by Beeler perhaps to overlay some Celtic idiom. Such a solution is unnecessary. Just as one can pay the penalty in Latin with the stock idiom poenam do, Patrick can pathetically give himself over to capture. Patrick signals his comedy with Roman idioms of emplacement in the rural-built environment. Fourth, Patrick reckons his life cycle and that of those around him in terms consonant with the Roman tradition. In his testimony, we encounter the full suite of Roman age ranges. Infantia, pueritas, adolescentia, juventia, virilitas, where one becomes a weird, or in the case of the Benedicta Scota, an adulta, senioritas and senectutas. These seem to correlate precisely with the Roman framework. Remember, he tells us he was seized as an adolescent, scarcely even a beardless boy. By the time he was writing, he was an old man, on account of which matter I seek in my old age to compose that which I did not compose in my youth. The crucial factor here is that Patrick tracks his life stages according to a Roman paradigm. Fifth, Patrick has digested the Roman barbarian ethnic script that animated Roman ethnic thinking. Patrick thus intuits liminality dividing Romans from non-Romans, a center-periphery affair that Guy Halsell describes as a diffuse barbaricum around a metropolitan Romania. But Roman for Patrick is byword for Christian. I dwell among barbarians and therefore gentes, by which he means, with Jerome, pagans. A proselyte, a refugee on account of my love of God. He uses the word gens 19 times, and every deployment could be read as meaning non-Christians. At the same time, when Patrick uses the word Romanus, which he uses twice, always in a genitive plural, he couples the word with adjectives referring to religion, in the Confessio Sanctus and in the Epistola Christianus. The equivalence is clear. For Patrick, to demonstrate Romanitas was to be a Christianus, a word he deploys 7 times. We can witness similar usage in Salvia de Marseille's De Gubernatione Dei. Put simply, Patrick thought himself in touch with the Roman world. Recently, Roy Fleckner has used Patrick's self-assessment to argue that his career must have begun in the main before 410, the date of the rescript of Honorius, when Romans allegedly withdrew from Britannia. To make sense of Patrick's evident Romanitas, Fleckner avers, the Roman world he felt himself in touch with must have still been politically, economically, and legally functional, indicating, to Fleckner's eye, a period of activity before 410. However, 410, according to Robin Fleming, does not emerge as a moment of decisive rupture in the archaeological record. Living in Britannia in 411 would have felt remarkably like living in Britannia in 409. When the Romans decamped, they had been present in Britannia for 350 years. We should expect, and indeed we find, that Britannia suffered a generational hangover of Romanitas. While it is true an identifiable post-Roman material horizon does emerge in Britannia, it would seem that the system's collapse suffered by Britannia did not really obtain until a generation after 410. Patrick could still be a Roman, even as the Roman world crumbled around him. From the foregoing, Patrick, a Roman, was likely born sometime in the 4th century. He likely died sometime in the 5th century. Any date offered would be as spurious as it would be scurrilous. But because Patrick, a Roman, was noble, we can imagine that he had received the rudiments of an education prior to his enslavement. Education in the Roman world was the purview of the elite. A young person, usually male, could encounter only the best education his family could afford, if any. Patrick came from a family of some means, and he himself gives an indication of his education, even if he laments its incompleteness, having been stolen into slavery. He calls himself untaught, not unlearned, as some have translated. He tells us, I formerly thought to write, but even up till now I have hesitated. I feared that I might trample the tongue of men, because I did not learn as others, who in the best way drank deeply both from laws and sacred letters, both in equal measures, and they never changed their way of speaking from infancy, but they always added the more to a stage of perfection. Patrick has a dire assessment of his own use of language. Just as now we separate the education of a child into discrete stages, preliminary, primary, secondary, tertiary education, in the United States, roughly preschool, kindergarten, elementary school, middle and high school, and college, so too did the Romans. Jerome provides us a peek into a Christian Roman preschool in a letter to Paula. Thus must a soul be educated, which is to be the temple of God. Get for her a set of letters made of boxwood or of ivory, and call each by its proper name, and let her play with these, so that even her play may teach her something. Quintilian, writing Institutio Oratoria in the 1st century, and whose approach to rhetoric Dan Meae identifies in the writings of Patrick, tells us what early childhood education would have looked like. What better occupation can a child have so soon as he is able to speak? And he must be kept occupied somehow or another. Or why should we despise the prophet to be derived before the age of 7, small though it be? For though the knowledge absorbed in the previous years may be but little, yet the boy will be learning something more advanced during that year, in which he would otherwise be occupied with something more elementary. Such progress each successive year is a clear profit to the period of youth. Further, as regards the years which follow, I must emphasize the importance of learning what has to be learnt in good time. From Quintilian, we're also able to abstract the tiers of education reckoned according to the stages of youth. Diocletian's price edict, for what it's worth, seems to accord with this approach to a tiered education. Whether this suite of educational opportunities would have been available to Patrick, I cannot say, but it is very likely that Patrick received some curriculum predicated on the Roman model. If I am correct that Romanus and Christianus were synonymous for Patrick, then we should also expect to find that the materials that underpinned that curriculum for Roman Christian education took on a rather Christian flavor. Gone are the days of Prudentius's St. Cassian and his death by 1,000 cuts. The schoolmaster, not necessarily always a conservative, as Beeler puts it, could be the avant-garde of a changing society. Cassidorius, writing 125 years after Patrick, hints at the results of the alteration of priorities. It is Cassiodorus who promulgated the trivium and quadrivium as distinct stages of education. Crucially, the trivium, comprising grammatica, rhetorica, and dialectica, could be completed by the mid to late teens, leaving the quadrivium, comprising arithmetica, musica, geometria, and astronomia, as higher order matters, an extension and refinement of the lower order matters. If Michael Lappage is correct, then 100 years after Patrick's Floruit, another Briton, Gildas, our sole British voice for the 6th century, was the product of an educational program that seemed to survive the dissolution of Roman administration in Britannia. If Patrick were seized during his 16th year, our age 15, Romans counted inclusively, then Patrick was just emerging from his grammatical studies into the study of rhetoric. It is this educational moment that Patrick regarded as interrupted. He dismissively refers to the signores of Britannia as Domini Cati Rhetorici, cunning rhetorical lords, resisting Beeler's problematic Dominicati Rhetorici, belorded rhetoricians. Patrick's nameless teacher evidently found an apt pupil, as we will see. Just as a Roman schoolboy could anticipate heavy doses of Virgil, a Christian schoolboy could anticipate heavy doses of Bible. If we were to take Patrick's regular recourse to Scripture as an index for his early education, and not just as an index for his sacerdotal training, then we are left with the conclusion that Patrick's educators were effective and successful. Say what you will about his Latin, and I will do just that shortly. The man knew his Bible the way Proba and Augustine knew their Virgil. So Patrick was a Roman, the beneficiary of a late Roman education. To be sure, this education was artificially arrested, but he received sufficient grounding in the rudiments to cut a serviceable figure. Any scholar who believes that Patrick could never have made up lost ground is wholly discounting non-traditional students, like the one who is addressing you today. Like Patrick, I dropped out of high school at 15. And like Patrick, I came to my scholarly vocation after a series of tumultuous tribulations. None so harrowing as Patrick's. Calling Patrick unlettered is not only wrong, it's offensive. Patrick's Latin has regularly been described as pedestrian and deficient, and on its face, such calumny seems warranted. As I will demonstrate, Patrick exhibits a statistical tendency that takes his language away from the ancient high style and has much more in common with the low style we can deduce from graffiti and ephemera. Still, perhaps Christine Moorman is too cruel when she says, as a philologist, I even venture to say that it is the most difficult Latin to understand and to criticize I have ever studied. She's mostly wrong. Patrick almost never leaves us with an impossibility. For those lucky enough to teach Latin and Greek to young people, you will appreciate what I mean. Patrick's Latin is reasonably sound grammatically and perfectly responsive to the Latin of his late 4th and early 5th century moment. simply because his Latin does not sit densely on the page like a Cicero, or stand like a nude statue, unadorned, straightforward, and graceful like a Caesar, does not mean he isn't producing effective language. He was just composing to different ends. Between Patrick's two texts, he uses about 5,600 words, depending on how one defines word. The number of lexemes he uses is closer to 5850. The word count of the Epistola is about 1,300, and that of the Confessio about 4,300. Here are two graphs charting the frequency of word forms in the Confessio and the Epistola. As you can see, Patrick's Latin closely observes Zipf's law, which holds that the most used word appears roughly twice as frequently as the next most used word, which appears twice as often as the third most used word, and so on until we're left with a long string of hapax legomena. 650 of Patrick's words are used twice or more. 1,519 words appear only once in the corpus. Therefore, Patrick's vocabulary is about 2,189 words strong. The ratio of his text to vocabulary, then, is about 2.5 to 1, meaning a unique word occurs every second or third word. Of this vocabulary, a bit more can be said. By turning to corpus linguistics, we can determine how strange Patrick's vocabulary is. I've isolated 4 excerpts from the Confessio and 2 from the Epistola, and performed a corpus search using the core Latin vocabulary published by Dickinson College Commentaries. This corpus of 997 words is quite powerful. For instance, 91% of Caesar's De Bella Gallico falls within the corpus. The number is 81% for Virgil's Aeneid. Here is a table of Patrick's proportion of core words. His language is more in line with classical Latin than the Latinists that follow him, like Gildas, the Faminator, Aldhelm, and Bede. Thus, his language presents no especial problem. If you can make sense of Cicero, Patrick's word hoard is a piece of cake. Cicero clocks in at 83% core, Patrick at 80.3. If Patrick's Latin is strange, its strangeness is not found in his vocabulary, which is precisely what we would expect from a Latinist trained under Roman energies in late antiquity. Still, some of his vocabulary falls outside the core. Of the non-core vocabulary in Patrick, several of the words, such as praevaleo and perfaccio, are compounded verbs of core vocabulary words. Much of the rest is taken up by Greek vocabulary that proliferated in late antique Christian circles. In Patrick, we encounter these following Hellenisms. And really, these words are those that facilitated the transition of Greek Christianity into a Latin idiom. Patrick's verbs are also very interesting. In the Confessio, he uses 751 finite verbs. Of these, 616 are in the indicative, 117 in the subjunctive, 11 are in the imperative, and 7 are deployed in shapes whose form and syntax could be construed either as indicative or subjunctive. Alongside these finite verbs, he uses 157 adjectival or nominal verbal forms, that is, 75 participles and 82 infinitives. In the Epistola, he uses 225 finite verb forms. Of these, 193 are indicatives, 28 are subjunctives, and 4 are deployed in shapes whose form and syntax could be construed either as indicative or subjunctive. Alongside these finite verbs, he uses 51 adjectival or nominal verb forms, that is, 35 participles and 16 infinitives. Now, the important ratio for both texts is the use of indicatives and imperatives to any other verbal form. Thus, for the Confessio, we have a ratio of 627 to 274, a ratio of about 2.5 to 1. For the Epistola, we have a ratio of 193 to 79, a ratio very close to 5 to 2. A ratio like this one indicates an author who is far more analytic than synthetic. The ratio for Cicero is close to 1 to 3 and Caesar 1 to 2.5. These numbers quantify Patrick's style. He favored coordination to subordination, parataxis to hypotaxis, and everywhere prefers the simple and declarative to the complicated and periodic. We can look at the types of constructions he favors. Here's a table for Patrick's subjunctive use. Between the two texts, I can identify 6 instances where Patrick seems to violate the sequence of tenses. For all the rest, Patrick is competent and regular. The subjunctive mood, the bane of Latin students everywhere, did not seem to vex Patrick. His tenses, too, are surprisingly regular. In his Confessio, Patrick prefers the present, 211 uses, for gnomic statements and appeals to the reader. And the perfect, 244 uses, is his unmarked narrative tense. His use of the imperfect, 70 uses, would then seem strange until one realizes that the plurality of his uses of the imperfect cluster at moments where he was narrating events and episodes in quick succession. His time spent pasturing in Ireland, his escape to the ship, and the like. In his epistola, we see a similar trend. More interested in interdiction than description, the majority of the verbs he frames in the present, 99 uses to 59 uses of the perfect. Only 4 imperfects are in evidence. In terms of nouns, I'll have relatively little to say so as not to overstay my welcome. Merely, Patrick fits quite comfortably into the expected word order of a writer of late Latin. The transition of Latin to Romance was one from SOV as unmarked word order to SVO as unmarked word order. Across both works, Patrick prefers to locate his subject before his verb rather than after his verb by a ratio of 5:2 for superordinate clauses and 4:1 in subordinate clauses. Patrick prefers to locate a verb's object after the verb rather than before it by a ratio of 5:3 in superordinate clauses and seems to have no preference in subordinate clauses. Verb non-final constructions, Patrick seems to prefer to verb final constructions by 5:3 in superordinate clauses and exhibits a slight tendency to verb finality in subordinate clauses. The ratio is 11:10. Of course, word order can vary widely given the necessities of emphasis. It is safe to say when Patrick departs from the constructions we would expect from a conventional late Latin author, he is doing so for reasons of emphasis. So Patrick's Latin has been lambasted because it's late, perceived low, and thought labored. But his language holds treasures for those willing to find them. And I'll show you what I mean. Patrick's formal education would have ended just as he was completing his grammatical training and beginning his rhetorical training. In the latter, we find that Patrick was a diligent student. Scholars have rightly pointed out that Patrick did not periodize. The Sententium Periodicum was, as Beeler put it, what for the ancients the art of letters consisted in above all. Patrick's inattention to the period has been taken as an index that his protestation to rusticity was not a mere humility topos. And indeed, when you see Patrick edited like, say, Cicero or Caesar, it becomes pretty clear that Patrick's Latin is something else entirely. However, as David Howlett has demonstrated, if Patrick is edited according to colla et comata, another picture altogether emerges. By laying Patrick's Latin out by sense units, eschewing punctuation for a line break, it becomes clearer that Patrick could deal with the clausula nimbly. All but 4 of Patrick's colons and commas scan perfectly according to one of the accepted cursus patterns for ending a clause. These 4, as Howlett notes, reconcile into perfect clausulae when the last 2 words are inverted. Hardly an artless rustic, Patrick controlled his colons and commas so well that he could play with them. If you are approaching Patrick to get a Cicero or a Caesar, you're due for a disappointment or a surprise. Scholars have too often reached the former, too rarely met the latter. Put simply, Patrick had mastered a form far more complex than the period. He had mastered cursus. Patrick's erudition, dare I say genius, is even deeper than the prose line. Into both works, he threaded elaborate parallelisms and chiasmal. What appears to be a jumble of misplaced information actually functions below the surface as an elegant and sophisticated framework that Patrick could fashion at will. Patrick's concerns were not Cicero's concerns. His compositional architecture was foundationally exquisite. He did not feel compelled to busy his proline. It used to be thought, with Beeler and Mormon, that Patrick's Latin, standing at the precipice of Romance, indicated a stint in Gaul for sacerdotal training. The abundant Gallicisms in his Latin would seem to suggest such a stay. But since Beeler and Mormon's publications, much evidence has been unearthed, literally, from Britannia, exposing us to a vibrant culture of Latinity. The completion of the RIB, the tablets at Vindolanda, the tabellae de fictionis lifted from the waters of Aquae Sulis, all speak to a Latin that J.N. Adams calls the Latin in Britain rather than the Latin of Britain. In this surmise, learned to be sure, Latin was never rooted enough to naturalize and to speciate the way it had in Hispania or Gallia. In this sense, the picture that emerges from Adams' book, The Regional Diversification of Latin, treats the Latin in Britain as an offshoot of Gallic Latin more broadly. The abundant Gallicisms in Patrick's Latin could well be an index of his nativity in the language. We need not posit a stay in Gaul, though I rather think that happened. So scholars have been cruel to Patrick. The TLL, ostensibly covering Latin to 600, makes no mention of Patrick. Adams does not have an index entry for Patrick. Even the DMLBS seems reticent to treat his language as language. How extraordinary. We have two pieces of capable Latin from the darkest moment of Britain's dark ages, and we do not appreciate them for what they are. When we factor in other superlatives, Patrick's account is the sustained narrative of an enslaved person who comments on his slavery from the Roman world. Patrick's account is the second autobiography ever written. Patrick's account is a captivity narrative. Ignoring Patrick is less a minimizing of inconvenience than a scholarly malfeasance. I wish to advance the following as a means of charting a new path forward. Patrick was a native speaker of Latin. Therefore, his works have a special value when read alongside, say, Petronius, Apuleius, and others who wrote in a low register. They have much more value when thinking about graffiti. When studying the precipice of late Latin and Romance alongside Egeria and Gregory of Tours, they matter. Exceptionally, we have multiple registers of British Latin, as noted by John Morris, from the same period when read alongside Pelagius and the Sicilian Britain. As an analog, we should reconsider Beeler's commentary on Patrick's language. Because he was operating under the suspicion that, in Kenneth Jackson's formulation, British Latin was unusually conservative, he was keen, as a matter of belletristic, to paradoxically see Patrick's Latin as both conservative and innovative at the same time. Indeed, the parallels he advances are drawn from hundreds of years after Patrick's time. How would Patrick's Latinity look different if we were to take his on his own terms in his own context? Second, Patrick was a capable Latinist. The mean-spirited bashing of Patrick's Latin misunderstands his self-deprecation. More to come on that shortly. The Latin he produced was analytical rather than synthetic, but it is, as a rule, a Latin that would please me were I to receive it as an instructor of language. It is not Cicero because Patrick didn't want it or need it to be. I agree with Howlett. The most misleading opinion to be changed is that Patrick was an inarticulate, artless man of simple piety, burdened by a sense of his own educational and intellectual inferiority. As critics, it's not our place to censure taste, but to understand the letters before us, and anything else uses the canon as a cudgel rather than a measuring utensil. Patrick's Latin reveals to us a thinker steeped in Bible and the intellectual currents of his day. His Latin witnesses some Hellenisms, and I rather think that Patrick had a smattering of Greek. Do the Grecicisms in his Latin arise from his knowledge of Greek or from the fact that Christian Latin was heavily Hellenized? I do not know, but I suspect that translating the Confessio and Epistola into, say, a Johannine or Pauline Greek would be a revelatory and useful experiment. An analog to the Hellenisms in Patrick's word hoard would be the innovation he makes in syntax, especially with respect to his use of participles and infinitives. While the vast majority of Patrick's infinitives are complementary, Patrick uses the infinitive in ways impermissible in the ancient high style. In Patrick's Latin, we find infinitives of both purpose and result, as in Greek. Patrick uses the participles with rather less confidence, but we find them collated and coordinated with finite verbs in a complementary sense, as in Greek. A deeper analysis would only reveal more analogous constructions. Finally, Patrick was hardly an artless rustic. He was well educated. His Latin is grammatically sound, is stylistically strange. His is an idiolect, one that bears the marks of his complicated life. He specifically chose to realize his written voice as a matter of considered deliberation, not crude deficiency. Take, for example, Confessio 6. The grouping of indeclinables toward the front of the clause is something really, really common in Patrick. Of course, Tamen is a postpositive, and this is not Tamen etsi as one word, as evidenced by the manuscript tradition. Tamen should be second in order here. Read with the belletristic eye, this chapter of his Confessio would not seem to rise to the high style. But when read empathetically, Patrick's decision-making becomes much clearer. He was focused on producing cursus. Patrick made the decision to write like he did. The question is why? Nobody who reads Patrick at first blush would accuse him of stylistic excellence. If he was able to accomplish such a relentlessly clausular prose line, then he was a Latinist of no mean sophistication. Yet he presents us with a Latin that could pass as pedestrian, barely above a halting conversational standard. To my mind, that was Patrick's point. Patrick was a jazz guitarist playing the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen. He deliberately reduced his linguistic register as an element of his rhetorical persona. Patrick evidently found that some prestige accrued to sounding like a bumpkin. And in the framework of early Christianity, a lack of perceived sophistication could serve as a compelling rhetorical posture. In Jerome, John Cassian, Sulpicius Severus, and Avitus of Vienne, we may find some answers. Christians of the first few centuries of the faith held rhetorical sophistication in some suspicion. Elevated language, this line of reasoning goes, could complicate Christian simplicity. The message of Christ was simplicity itself, obviating the need for flourish and polish in favor of unadorned directness. Jerome sounded an ambivalent tone on the adoption of ancient proven rhetorical forms to preaching and exegesis. Famously, in Epistula 22, he recounts a dream in which he is brought before a tribunal and the judge declared, "You are a Ciceronian, not a Christian." Jerome was evidently shaken by what he took to be a vision. "Oh Lord, if ever I possess secular books, I have denied you if I read them." But Jerome seemed to lack the courage of his convictions. As Harold Hagendahl makes plain, Jerome regularly makes recourse to the fonts of secular oratory throughout his corpus of letters. Even so, in that same letter, he is able to say, "What does Horace make of the Psalter? Virgil, the Gospel, Cicero, the letters of Paul?" The implication would seem to be that classical forms of erudition have no place in a Christian framework, that such trumpery is dissonant with the gospel truth. John Cassian agrees with Jerome in the main. According to Cassian's Constitutiones, kenodoxia, empty teaching, which we should understand as vainglorious oratorical sophistication, was the seventh of 8 principal vices. Kenodoxia, Cassian equates with rhetorical accomplishment and savvy speaking. Those who, receiving the simple faith of fishermen in the manner of a playing heart, did not receive it in the manner of a worldly spirit or dialectical syllogism from the eloquence of a Cicero. Truer faith was a faith simply expressed, neither sophisticated nor complicated, but limpid, pure, and humble. Sulpicius Severus likewise adopts this posture in the very prologue of the Vita Martini. "The kingdom of God consists not in eloquence, but in faith. Let one be mindful, moreover, that salvation was not preached to the world by orators, but by fishermen." Avitus completes this picture. The less polished a Latinist style, the greater his comprehensibility. And since our language they will consider something more intelligible, which is less polished, in the letter which you have ordered to be composed by my colleague, faults can be dictated with security. The low style for Avitus is an aid to intelligibility. Christianity had no place for crafty rhetoricians. The testimonies of Jerome, John Cassian, Sulpicius Severus, and Avitus all build to a certain displacement of learning outcomes between pedagogical orientations organized according to a framework of Roman civic polytheism and those organized according to a Christian framework. Even so, each of these authors were sophisticates in their own right. None fully divested themselves of the intellectual processes that refined their language. Patrick, on the other hand, understood this impulse and put to practice its implications. His rusticity was a benefit, not a detriment, to his authorial ethos. His non-rhetoric was actually a species of rhetoric. In a sense, the spirit of anti-intellectualism has its roots in the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes, in the main, is a promise of revolution. The last will be first, the first last. This cosmic inversion, which Nietzsche would call the slave revolt of morality, naturally extended to education. Sounding worldly and educated became a marker of venality. Crucially, the Beatitudes are 2 stretches of gospel that Patrick never cites. He didn't need to. The language of his Confessio and his Epistola was a tableau vivant of the Beatitudes. His low language he regarded as a marker of his authenticity and evidence of his commitment to Christian simplicity. No one was as good at sounding bad as Patrick. So successful was his rhetorical effect that scholars have, by and large, gone along with his protestation of rusticity. Other authors, when they falsely claim incapacity, were engaged in a rote humility topos. Patrick put his money where his mouth was. Almost uniquely in Christian letters, we have an author whose skill outstripped his task, whose rhetorical persona eclipsed his actual ability, and whose language was specifically designed for a desired effect. Put simply, he succeeded. Indeed, the entirety of his corpus could be read as a giant liturgies, an understatement that amounts to overstatement. Patrick was not unintelligent. As a matter of conclusion, I want to say a few words about what we miss as scholars interested in patristics when we leave aside Patrick. First, Patrick was the author of the second autobiography ever written. If Peter Brown is correct in his estimation that the confluence of Roman culture and Christian soteriology made possible the means of elevating the self as a reasonable object of study, then our first example, Augustine, is followed by mere decades by our second example, Patrick himself. True, there is no means of verifying through language that Patrick had ever heard of Augustine. I rather think the same intellectual impulse occurring in such quick succession yearns for some explanation. The Christian self, ensouled, individual, and independent, is a quantity shared between Augustine and Patrick at a very early date. That cannot have been a mistake. Second, it pays to think ecclesiologically about what Patrick was doing in his two surviving writings, especially the Epistula. What we have from Patrick is the earliest instrument of anathema that I know of. Prior instruments have been scriptural or conciliar. Patrick makes excommunication something regional and specific to a given action in a given circumstance. Thus, Patrick is integral to the history of excommunication as a concept. In Patrick, we find a regional ecclesiastic with confidence enough to promulgate a general succession of interaction. Here, we ought to be sensitive to parallels elsewhere. Third, Patrick's ministry is something wholly without predication in extra-scriptural Christian letters. He was a missionary bishop. True, the details of his elevation and the specifics of his consecration he does not make clear, but the general sense he gives of his mission reads more in common with Joseph Conrad than with Athanasius. His was a message to be delivered that just so happened to promise deliverance. The Catholic tradition, as opposed to the Anglican tradition, does not really have a category of missionary bishop, and like the Anglican tradition, I think that Patrick's mission was tied up with notions of imperialism. Keep in mind, Patrick equated the terms Romanus and Christianus. In a sense, Patrick was conquering a place with the word that never submitted to the sword. In that sense, he was offering a means to Romanitas. Christianity was the mechanism by means of which a people could intercourse with the Roman world. Patrick, as a missionary bishop, was spreading the faith, sure, but he was also spreading the concept of aspirational Romanitas. Finally, Patrick makes plain his sense for Christian geography. He was especially fond of the enjoinder in Acts 13:47. I have made you a light to the Gentiles in order that you may bring salvation all the way to the ends of the earth. That piece of scripture is for Patrick intellectually fertile. He quotes it outright twice, and he alludes to it two more times. Clearly, he felt as though his ministry were transpiring at the limits of the oikoumene, at the ends of the earth, and so satisfied, according to Thomas O'Loughlin, the preconditions necessary for the parousia. In this sense, Patrick thought about his mission in eschatological terms, that his mission, in addition to being apostolic, was apocalyptic. By taking Patrick, a forgotten father, seriously, rather than stopping abruptly at his only apparently deficient Latin, would enrich patristics by taking seriously exponents of the low along with the high. Not every writer was a Tertullian, an Irenaeus, or an Origen. Sometimes we get a Patrick, an earnest and genuine thinker, willing to consign himself to imagined ignorance rather than to succumb to the sin of vainglory. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Justin, for that wide-ranging and presentation, putting Patrick back in his place as a patristics figure. So thank you so much. Just want to open the floor for questions and discussion. Yeah, Alexander, if you'd like to unmute. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have three questions, but for now, I'll only ask the first two, which are related. First question is, have you published material from this lecture, and if not, will you? And the second question is, because I think it's really good. Second question is there any article which has already been published that you would recommend on Patrick's education?
Ooh, Patrick's education. So the first, the answer to your first question is parts of this lecture are buried in footnotes in an article that I published in Viator, where I actually argued something kind of opposite to this. But he very much did think of himself as a Roman, right? Is the first thing to keep in mind. And that is, at least to my mind, somewhat incontestable, just given what he wrote about himself. this lecture, as I said, is kind of an opening salvo. It's a book project that I'm working on. As soon as Alex, my book is published through Princeton, this book, parts of this will emerge in the Breppels volume. In terms of Patrick's education, he doesn't really mention much about his instructors, right? He mentions that he was disobedient to his priests and things like that, and so was deserving of capture and these kinds of things, but nothing of his education necessarily. What one has to do is look at his Latin and deduce where he fell on that kind of educational spectrum. By looking at what education he could expect to have received in late antiquity, it emerges that it seems as though he would have been snatched and seized away from his education right about the time he said he was, right? Now, of course, a scholar, a non-traditional student can indeed make up lost ground. And this idea that he never could have, formed, a coherent thought in Latin because he was stolen is just preposterous. His Latin is, perfectly serviceable. It's not Ciceronian, and if you're approaching it with an belletristic eye, it's going to fall short. But it's not like it's senseless, right? So that would be my say. There's a great book, RPC Hansen. His book has a lengthy chapter on the sort of what Patrick could have expected as a late Roman kind of petty noble. David Howlett's Liber Epistolarum is also very good in terms of diving into Patrick's use of cursus. So,
Thank you, Alexander. Just when you make me host again, just before I forget.
Oh, I don't know how to do that.
click on my picture and then the three dots to make host. Yeah, thanks.
You are now host again, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks. Any other questions? Piero? Yeah. I remember this in conversation with you, Justin, before. You mentioned there's another, I think it's a Greek source, but I'm not sure what period that is from in terms of, was it also someone who was a slave?
I think what you're referencing, Alex, is Priscus and his fragmentary history. He meets a nameless Greek in the sort of camp, the court of Attila the Hun, and he's really surprised that he speaks Greek. It's like, how does this barbarian speak Greek? He's going around looking like he's dressed in the barbarian style, and so Priscus and this nameless Greek engage in some colloquy that where they debate whether or not you have it better in the late Roman world or the barbarian world. And of course, this is a fanciful concoction by Priscus, right? It's extremely unlikely that he engaged in this kind of colloquy at the court of Attila the Hun. But yeah, so we have this tradition of individuals sort of being seized. This I've called it captivity narratives. And so these captivity narratives are quite interesting because we have Cyprian talking about sort of ransoming captives as Augustine does. Orosius says that he was held captive, right? And so we have these sort of mentions of captivity in late antiquity. And I find it to be really fascinating because, of course, that's a genre of literature in North America, right? The captivity narrative in colonial America, where that was a vehicle by means of which ethnographic knowledge could be shared between peoples. So it's really, really interesting because these people spent time outside of the Roman world, ostensibly. What did they bring back? What kind of information? What kind of new ideas? What sort of vehicles were they for thinking about barbaricum, right, as this diffuse entity swirling around the Roman world? So. But yeah, there's parallels. So we have an Eastern parallel basically to Patrick, even though I don't think that the nameless Greek ever actually existed in the way Patrick most manifestly did.
Thank you. Thanks, Justin. Any other questions and discussion? Damien? Yeah.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for a deeply fascinating presentation. I think underestimating Patrick is a dangerous policy. I just want to ask you something about his Romanitas and his Roman identity. Isn't Patrick really about not sort of giving so much a root to Romanitas as separating Romanitas from Christianity? If you look at what Patrick is doing in the context of contemporary writers, where the chauvinism and Roman chauvinism is still riding high. If you say Paulinus of Nola, when he's talking about Patricius of Rouen, his program of conversion is not just about conversion to Christianity; it's also a program of civilizing, and not just civilizing the people, civilizing even the landscape. Taking a country of barbarian waves and sort of unruly terrain and essentially civilizing it. And there's absolutely nothing of that in Patrick. He recognizes the Irish. He says they're barbarians. I mean but I think he uses that very much as a sort of as a term to describe a non-Roman people.
Well, so the question of the Patrick's ethnonymic use is actually quite an interesting one. I refer you to my Viator article from last year, where we can kind of see that Patrick doesn't really use Scotus and Hibernus. Hiberniaci is how he refers to the neutral Irish in a very strange hapax legomemnon. And so he definitely understands that not all the Irish are Scoti, and that's the word he uses for barbarous Irish. When he turns to use the word gens, he oftentimes means pagan, right? Like we would say Gentile, basically, gentilis. And with that, he sort of shares some with Jerome. In terms of his, as you say, decoupling Christianitas from Romanitas, I don't see that at all. I think that he treats the two terms substantially synonymously. And the reason I think that is because he uses Romanus twice as a designator, and both are in double-barreled adjectives, basically referring to religion, right? Referring to the church, frankly. And so I do think that he would understand, and again, along with Salvian of Marseille, like Romanus to be Christianus, like the two terms are functionally synonymous for him. And so in that sense, by converting to Christianitas, in a sense, you're converting to Romanitas. This idea of sort of civilizing the landscape, I think, is a very interesting one. Patrick doesn't really give a lot of attention to landscape. If you think of his sort of flight from slavery, it happens in the space of a sentence, right? He flattens what must have been 200 miles, right, into a single phrase. And so landscape isn't something that I think necessarily preoccupies Patrick, other than the fact he's not in the land of his birth. His sort of notional Britannia is that of sort of a place of absence. He yearns to go and visit his family there, or the Gauls. He yearns to go and visit his friends there. Interestingly, Patrick always uses Britannias in the plural, referring, of course, to the provinces of Britain, Gallias in the plural as well, which would seem that would seem to denote his being in touch with some late Roman provincial moment. So, does that answer your question?
Well, in terms of sort of late historiography of the empire. Where the empire is quite explicitly associated with Christianity. The empire starts under Augustus, and Christ is born in the reign of Augustus. So the empire and the empire and the church have their common beginnings, and sort of this link between empire and church is canonized in Eusebius, and then goes forward from there, in the sense that the way Christianity spreads is through the empire.
Yep.
And through Latinate culture in the West. So, the empire spreads, civilizes, and then Christianity, then conversion happens. So the proper sequence is that empire conquers, slaps some manners on the aboriginals, and then the church rolls in and converts them to Christianity. That doesn't happen at all in Ireland, at all, because it's outside of the empire. And when Patrick talks about the Coroticus, and he says to Coroticus, he uses fascinating language. He says Coroticus comes to Ireland and he converts and he captures Patrick's converts, and Patrick, describes them still having the chrism shining on their foreheads and their white robes, which seems to be highly improbable. I presume this is part of his rhetorical, rhetorical force of his argument. For Coroticus, like others inside in the empire, he cannot accept that you can go from being a raw barbarian to a Christian without the intervening process of being civilized. And that seems to me to be the real reason why Patrick got into a tangle with his British superiors, because he's doing things the wrong way around. Because if they're to accept that you can go from being a raw barbarian to becoming a Christian, what's the point of the empire? What's the point of Romanitas? And I know that there are sort of, there are jibes made against Patrick on the basis of what he tells us of himself, because of the lack of education, which I think you've dealt with quite effectively. Patrick's lack of education is appalling in how he presents himself. But the marks made against him of being a sinner, being unsuitable, being incapable, these all are transformed in Patrick's works into badges of success, because if on a human level he should have been a dramatic failure, and yet he succeeds. When he's admitting to these failures, he's actually drawing attention to the divine origin of his mission. But it seems to me that he's most completely subversive in his attitudes towards an extra-imperial barbarian people, and bringing them from being raw barbarians to being Christians without that intervening.
The civilizing, civilizing effect of politics. I think it's an interesting observation. I think it's an interesting intervention. It's one I'll have to think more about. But I do think that Patrick is equating his mission with some sort of civilizing thought. He uses the language of citizenship, for instance, when deriding Coroticus. Civis daemanorum, non civis Romanorum, or sanctorum. And so I do think that he is dealing in these kind of extra-liminal spaces of Romanitas, and he is thinking that Christianity is itself a civilizing vehicle. The idea that the process of empire is one whereby barbarians are cooked into suitable candidates for evangelization, perhaps, but Patrick is certainly dealing with a different framework in that regard. He's not bringing politics; he's bringing sort of a religious idea, right, along with him. That I think he equates with what, in some sort of foundational sense, with what it means to be a Roman. So, at least in his understanding. So.
Thank you, Damien. Any final questions? Piero? Yeah.
No, Alexander was first. After him.
Alexander? Alex, do you want to go there, Alexander?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you. Can you expand on what you said with there being a big difference between untaught and unlearned? Are you saying he could have used an alternative Latin word there?
So the word he uses is inductus, and the various translators have taken that as unlearned. It means untaught, right? And so for Patrick, this seems to be kind of a powerful idea, right? That what he has is not the intervention of an instructor, so to speak, right? That he sort of has some unfiltered access to the divine, right? He sees the Holy Spirit praying inside of his heart and these kinds of things. He has some very evocative language in that regard. So I think that he is using inductus, untaught, as a kind of a rhetorical badge, right? He is specifically executing a lower linguistic register than he would seem to be otherwise capable of, and saying, "Oh, I'm so dumb. I have privileged knowledge." Basically, is the idea. And so his inductus comment is I think part of that rhetorical persona that I was talking about. That answer your question?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Piero?
First of all, thank you, Professor Michael Colvin. It was an excellent paper and a lot of information. My question is very brief. We know, of course, that Patrick was almost in the same period that St. Augustine of Hippo. Patrick, if I'm not wrong, 3 decades later, around that.
We don't really have any indication of, so I rather think that he was probably born in the late 4th century, around 390. I think that any time somebody is advancing dates in terms of Patrick, you're on shaky terrain. I think that we can kind of deduce more or less when his moment transpired. But yeah, he is roughly a junior contemporary of Augustine.
Yes, and in that line, my question, Professor, is, and I think that it was very interesting the line that you spoke about education in this Roman model. As a Latinist, all the background as a Roman citizen in the beginning of his life, of course, and we know if Patrick had some education in the meaning of some classic Greek writers like Virgil, Cicero, Lucretius, Plato, Homer, some. As for example, we know that Augustine was very read in Virgil and Cicero, but do we know the same about Patrick?
So we have the Augustine drank deeply from the font of Virgil and Cicero, but he tells us as well that he really did not enjoy his study of Greek, right? So I think this is when we get sort of a rupture between I guess the two sides of the Mediterranean, so to speak. Patrick gives us no indication insofar as we can't really find any verbal or phrasal parallels to authors that are not Christian, and especially the verbal parallels that we're able to identify is principally from Jerome, and so he doesn't. And of course, the line that Andy Kane identified from Confessio 10. Adulekin's emo in Barabbas, so on and so forth. That itself seems to be an adaptation of a Ciceronian line, but there's no direct chain of custody from, say, a Cicero to a Patrick. Anything would have been filtered through something else he would have read. I think that's probably because the curriculum that he was a part of in his youth was had been Christianized, and so the language that he thought in wasn't really Ciceronian; it was far more scriptural. But that's my suspicion, and I don't think it'd be possible really to apply some textual test to that. I just think that he, because he's not demonstrating his familiarity with sort of the set canon of authors from antiquity, it would indicate to me that his education was predominantly Christian in nature. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor.
Absolutely,
that's great.
Thank you, Piero. Just very briefly, Justin, the plan for this book project is to publish it in the series in Brepols. Yeah, the same one with Dr. Alfred Osborne.
Yeah, that's right.
It'll be in that series. So I'll just, I suppose I'm curious, how will this I suppose, differentiate or maybe correct somewhat Roy Fleckner's recent book on Patrick, and maybe build from that.
Sure. Well, Dr. Fleckner's book is excellent. First of all, he's an excellent writer, excellent thinker. I happen not to agree with his sort of placing Patrick at an earlier in the 4th century. I think that's an unnecessary imposition on the materials. And so one of there's a few things that this book promises. It's going to be a rather Teutonic tome, so it's going to be one of these big sort of philological sort of things. In my projected view of it, and it's going to give a full examination of Patrick's Latin, which Beeler provides some in his commentary on his edition. Christine Moorman in 1961 published on Patrick's Latin, but very little has been done since then. And the intervening decades has produced a massive amount of Latin in Britannia. And so I think that you can actually sort of test Patrick's Latin against what survives in Britain. The other thing that I am hoping that this project will accomplish is if we can establish the very bare bones of Patrick's career chronologically, then what we can do is we can start using disciplines drawn from the archaeosciences. So lakebed stratigraphy or ice core samples and these kinds of things to start recreating the climate that would have been that Patrick would have lived in, literal climate, not the metaphorical climate. And so if we do that, then what we're able to do is we're able to sort of make connections with text, as Michael McCormick has shown in a number of his publications. And if we're able to do that, then we can kind of get a more refined sense, not only for Patrick's chronology, but also the sort of material and climatological circumstances that beset him. So it's going to be a big book. And I don't mean big in terms of its importance. I mean big in terms of its being a doorstop. And so it's going to do something that Fleckner's book kind of didn't do. His was very much for a popular audience, and it was very good and very useful. So,
thank you